I am standing in front of the memorial to Thomas Guy, a publisher of unlicensed Bibles who made a fortune in the South Sea bubble and who established Guy's Hospital in 1721 to treat incurables discharged from St. Thomas's Hospital just up the road. In the past, for the majority of patients, getting a diagnosis of cancer was like being given a death sentence. They were incurable. Now it's a different story. There are so many treatment options. It is more like managing a chronic disease such as diabetes. But all this comes at a cost. At an individual level, these treatments come with side effects, sometimes very severe. At a societal level, there is a financial cost. The interventions are often very expensive. So it's a question of balancing the costs and the benefits at both levels. It's about assessing the value of the drug. How this can be done fairly has interested me all my professional career. No more so than between 1999 and 2012, when I was the Clinical and Public Health Director of a newly established institution called NICE, the National Institute for Health and Care Excellence. However, my interest was just about to get more personal. 2 years ago, I was diagnosed with throat cancer. A T2N2A HPV positive, locally invasive squamous cell carcinoma to be exact, or more commonly known as the cancer that the film star Michael Douglas suffered with. 18 months later, after having had surgery, radiotherapy and chemotherapy, I am in remission. Now, I was doubly qualified to consider the issues of cancer treatment from all aspects. Last year, I was invited by the Welsh Assembly Government to participate in a review of how expensive drugs are accessed by individual patients when not available in the Welsh NHS, through the individual patient funding process, the so-called IPFR process. This was established because of what happened to Irfan Williams, a nurse who was diagnosed with cancer but had to move to England to get the treatment. Irfan's story provides the backcloth for all the key issues in creating a fair and equitable health service.
We set up a campaign called Hawl I Fyw, or The Right to Live in English, because we felt so strongly about it that people had died unnecessarily so in Wales, or died prematurely. And we felt that the system was very unfair. And we campaigned hard and had a lot of backing from thousands of people across Wales and the UK. And the campaign went massive. And people felt really strongly about it and how unfair the process was. At that point, I'd received my treatment in England and it had been successful. I'd had to move across the border to live in England, change my GP, change my address, and was accessing cetuximab over in the Christies in Manchester. And the outcome was I had overall 60% shrinkage of my tumours, leading to the ability to have surgery. The process of the IPFR that families had to go through was something that really needs to be addressed. It needs to be fairer, it needs to be more transparent, it needs to be better understood by clinicians, it needs to be better understood by families. We weren't saying that we wanted all treatments for everybody. We weren't naive enough to know that that's not possible. The government agreed that they would put an independent panel together to review the IPFR process, and I was privileged enough to be invited onto the panel.
While the Cancer Drugs Fund in England appeared to be considered a good news story, the reality was somewhat more mixed. Professor Peter Clark, who had responsibility for managing the fund, explains why.
The Cancer Drug Fund was a political creation in 2010 following an election pledge by the then future Prime Minister, Mr. Cameron. And the aim that he wished to achieve was for the Cancer Drugs Fund in 2010 in England to just fund the cancer drugs that had not been recommended by the National Institute for Health and Care Excellence. It had many successes and it had significant failures. And the first success was that it dramatically increase access of cancer drugs to cancer patients. It speeded up the access of cancer drugs to patients. It increased access to patients with rare cancer drugs. It increased access to what we call off-label use. It had significant failures. There was an initial lack of emphasis on reimbursement, and what drug companies, or some drug companies soon realized, is that you could get reimbursed by the Cancer Drug Fund at what we call the full list price for a pharmaceutical product, whereas if you went through the NICE process and gained the conclusion of clinical and cost effectiveness, you would often have to drop your price. It soon became overspent, particularly from 2014 onwards. That's inevitable when you have an ever-increasing list of drugs to potentially fund that have been turned down by NICE. Because it had a fixed budget, even though it was overspent, there was great pressure to reduce funding, and the only way that you can reduce funding is by what we call reprioritizing, which means that if you have a new and exciting drug coming in, you've got to get rid of drugs that are currently in the fund. So it could be a drug in 1 year, out the next. Is that a rational way of commissioning chemotherapy? The answer is no.
In 2016, NHS England reviewed the Cancer Drugs Fund, and it was decided that in the future it would be managed jointly with NICE. Specifically, the new Cancer Drugs Fund to allow drugs that NICE was unsure if they were cost effective or not to be available in the NHS, on condition that data would be collected in order to make a final decision. Sir Andrew Dillon has been the Institute's Chief Executive Officer right from its inception, and he explains how it works.
The new Cancer Drugs Fund is intended to help that. It's a specific amount of money which in part is going to be used in order to fund, by agreement with the company, which will be making its contribution to this too, but to help to fund those treatments that we think have got real potential, but we just don't have enough information on at this point. I absolutely understand why, when we make a decision that restricts access to a treatment, especially a new treatment, particularly for something like cancer, that the reaction that you read in the newspapers or that you hear from individuals who are interviewed on the media is perfectly understandable. They're expressing a genuinely held view, sometimes as strong as a sense of outrage that they're being deprived of something that might help to extend their lives, for example, or otherwise make a huge difference to their quality of life. And it's really important that we hear those voices, that those voices have the opportunity to express their view, because if nothing else, it's simply illustrating the fact that the NHS, whilst it does a huge amount, in the end reaches the limits of what it's capable of doing, and that difficult choices have to be made.
But not everyone feels the same way about this new Cancer Drugs Fund. Let us hear from Dr. Annette Ridd, a bioethicist.
So the NHS is working within a fixed healthcare budget where money spent on one type of treatments or one bundle of treatments cannot be spent on other treatments because the budget is fixed. So by giving special weight or special funds to cancer patients, that means that this money is not available to spend on patients elsewhere.
So the fund may be considered as unfair across treatments, but also for other cancer patients.
The second inequity that's introduced by the Cancer Drugs Fund is actually not between cancer patients and other patients, but between different cancer patients. So note that this is a Cancer Drugs Fund, but drugs are not the only treatments for cancer. There are all sorts of other treatments that are not eligible for funding through this Cancer Drugs Fund. I'm thinking, for example, of radiotherapy, which is a very potent cancer treatment for many cancers. I'm thinking of surgery, things like that, that basically don't qualify. So again, that seems kind of a little odd. If you do think that cancer is something that merits special consideration, then it should be not just one particular type of treatment, but it should be all sorts of treatment.
Let us return to the IPFR review that Irvin mentioned. Let's hear directly from the politician who set it up, Vaughan Gething, Cabinet Secretary for Health and Sport in Wales.
There's obviously widespread interest and concern because Lots of the cases that get publicised are those where there are often very tragic or very difficult circumstances where people want individual treatment that is often hard to come by. And there's the decision-making process that I don't think has been well understood, but also then to try and understand the rationale for that as well. So it's the perception and then the reality of what we've done. We had a previous review a couple of years ago, and we agreed to undertake another review. That review took place with a range of different experts. It also had a patient voice within that as well, because we wanted to understand properly and clearly during the review what this looked like and how it felt from the patient perspective. And so we reviewed both the criteria that people looked at and how that process works. The outcome of the review has been, after lots of engagement, a report where I've accepted all of the recommendations.
And now, here is the chairman of the review, Andrew Blakeman.
Our conclusions were that the principle of exceptionality was confusing, and we replaced it with a concept that looked at whether or not a treatment would give clinical benefit and reasonable value for money. That was the only issue of principle we found. So we found lots of practical issues. In fact, I think the practical issues were much more significant than the issues of principle.
But while the system can be made fairer and more transparent, the review panel still realised that difficult decisions would need to be made.
These are hard issues and they affect individuals' lives, so it's very painful, but I do strongly favour relying on the evidence and putting health resources where they will do most benefit for most people. So a really expensive cancer drug that has a chance of saving someone's life or increasing their lifespan slightly is not as powerful for me as, for example, having a really great maternity ward where babies are born safely, or having great public health campaigns that mean that people smoke less or drink less or exercise more.
Everyone, patients included, want the decisions to be based on the best evidence and consider it acceptable to assess value for money.
There is no endless pot of money to treat everybody with everything. We have to be sensible about evidence-based medicine, and we have to be sensible about understanding what works and what's cost-effective and what's best for the whole population.
But people also seem to be clear that variation to access is a bad thing. That applies within countries, but also between countries.
So you asked whether it mattered whether the 3 or the 4 countries in the United Kingdom had different regimes. And I think it does matter, because it creates a huge sense of injustice if at the borders, if somebody living on one side of the border has access to one treatment and somebody the other doesn't.
This is a very common view. Annette Ridd mentioned that many cancer patients have other treatments, for example radiotherapy. Ali is a patient who had radiotherapy as well as drugs. We asked her if variation across countries was acceptable.
I think that's totally shocking. It wouldn't have crossed my mind that it wouldn't have been the same. It should be best practice everywhere, and I think that's absolutely shocking.
So we have a problem. You have a good process in England and Wales and still have variation. What is happening in Scotland? Catherine Calderwood is its Chief Medical Officer.
We have talked in Scotland a lot about realistic medicine. So I think more transparent conversations about drugs is very important too. So some of the side effects of the end-of-life drugs, some of the burden of healthcare where people are spending a long time in hospital, perhaps away from their families. Do they understand that burden of those drugs? And for some people that will be the right thing. They maybe will live longer to see a daughter's wedding or an important family event. But for other people, perhaps they would maybe want to stay at home, maybe not live as long a time, but actually be symptom-free or have time at home with their families.
So systems can be good, but still lead to variation in access to expensive cancer drugs. How can politicians address this challenge, given health in the UK is a devolved responsibility? What do political scientists think?
Inevitably, if you go down the path of devolution, as the UK has in the last couple of years, inevitably some differences will arise, and indeed quite often these differences are actually celebrated. So, you know, especially when it comes to national identity and preserving sort of your own kind of national heritage, national culture in the devolved nations, it's something very much that is being celebrated by both the populations and the politicians in the devolved nations. But of course, when it comes to health services, it's much more difficult. It's kind of then a question of, well, how do you balance or consider different aspects of national identity, but also the need to fairly distribute services and to fairly grant access to services amongst patients with the same disease categories. And also for politicians, I think, coming back to your questions around whether this is an issue for politicians, I think it is a very real issue, because on the one hand, in their devolved nations, they need to be seen as still sort of representing and standing up for the relative independence of their countries, of their devolved nations. But at the same time, they don't want to be seen as somehow being unable to not provide the same quality of healthcare that maybe their neighboring devolved national partners.
I'm sitting next to a statue of John Keats. He registered as a medical student at Guy's Hospital in 1815, and by 1816 he had already received his apothecary's license, which made him eligible to practice as an apothecary, physician and surgeon. But before the end of the year, he announced to his guardian that he was resolved to be a poet and not a surgeon. I wonder if he would have made as famous a surgeon as a poet. We have heard that patients and the public accept the need to assess value for money, but we want health prioritization decisions to be fair and evidence-based. But how can they be reassured that their health services are functioning in this way? My research team at King's College London, in conjunction with colleagues of University College London, have developed a new approach to helping patients understand how these decisions are made and to encourage the public to get involved in making these difficult decisions. The approach is based on a social values framework, which has been converted into a decision-making audit tool, the DMAT. My group has now joined with a design company to develop a digital online version which consists of a series of questions relating to content values, what works and at what cost, and process values, openness and inclusivity. These could act as principles underpinning decision-making. You can use this tool to assess how local or national organisations are making healthcare decisions on your behalf. Irfan Williams died on the 30th of May 2017, just 2 months after his interview. His wife Becky said that he passed away peacefully, with me by his side. Throughout, Irfan faced his illness with courage and dignity. In his final weeks, he has been nursed at home, surrounded by those who love him. There has been no battle lost to cancer. His body became tired, but his mind was as strong as ever until the end. My last email from Irfan was just 2 weeks beforehand, when I told him how dignified and powerful his messages were. His email response was, "Thanks, Peter. I look forward to seeing the film. Things are not so great here. I have pneumonia at the moment, and I'm in the later stages of cancer. But I'm at home and coping reasonably well, hoping to survive for the Lions tour."